Long ago, a lonely seabird on the first leg of a great journey arrived at a distant land carrying a single cone from a fir tree. It was late autumn, and the cone was fully ripe with its pollen and seeds already mixed together within its scales. The bird, thinking he would be hungry after his passage, intended to eat the seeds, but he was now so very tired that he could hold on to his burden no longer. The cone plummeted to the earth, where it came to rest on a sunny hill. Its seeds spilled forth and covered the ground where they would lay for most of the day, until a distracted stag came rushing out from the nearby undergrowth and trampled them, pushing the seeds under the soil. The winter was a particularly harsh one, with frozen heaps of snow and ice that lingered into April, but the seeds relished in the cold. It softened their outer shells, and by late May, a few seedlings could be seen pushing up through the soil, seeking out the sun. Of these, most were eaten by the forest animals, but one remained, and it burgeoned and flourished. As time went by, the little fir grew and grew. After a little more than 30 summers, it reached a great height of some 40 feet. With each passing year, however, the tree became increasingly unhappy, and its branches began to droop and sway. A tree's greatest longing is for a human to consider its wood worthy enough to be used in a grand building project or a craftsman's cabinet shop. But each winter, when the woodsmen came to harvest trees, the fir was never chosen. Although they admired its ability to stay green throughout the year, they also realized just from looking that its timber was not much good for anything but firewood or fence post. The tree could almost feel the scorn and ridicule of the other nearby trees, as they were carried off now and then over the years to be used in the service of humans. The fir had another good reason for being unhappy. None of its seeds had ever managed to take root and grow. Thus it began to lose hope of leaving behind any progeny in the world, and it felt all alone. The area around the tree eventually became a fine garden that was well tended, and which the nearby townspeople often visited. One day a holy man came into the garden, and sat by the tree to offer his supplications during the third watch of the night, before anyone in the village stirred. When his devotions were through, the sun had come up. He gazed at the tree's sagging branches and spoke to it, saying, "Don't be so glum, my friend. I have no progeny either, but one doesn't need progeny to be remembered. Nevertheless, you shall have offspring." Then he patted the tree and blessed it. The holy man came and sat by the tree many more times after that. He often spoke to it and offered encouraging words. Soon the tree's branches began to stand upright again. A few years went by and nothing seemed to change, but the fir never lost hope. It had come to believe the man's words would come true. One morning he appeared in the garden during the third watch as usual, this time accompanied by some companions who slept in the soft grass while he offered his devotions. The holy man seemed downcast, the tree thought. He never spoke to the fir, but instead remained intensely quiet, as did the forest itself. Every creature remained in its abode, hushed and motionless. There wasn't the slightest breeze. Not one leaf fell to the ground, but the silence held within it a great fervor of anticipation, and as the night drew to a close, the man began to stir and tremble. Soon his body began to shake in apparent grief and something very close to despair. By the end, his clothing appeared soaked in bloody drops of sweat. The tree pitied the man, his only friend. It wanted to ask why he was so grieved, and to reach down with his branches to surround him and keep him safe. But just then the holy man turned to the tree and said, "Thank you for your kind thoughts, friend. But in truth, my sorrow is your joy." As he spoke, the perspiration fell from his face to the earth and onto the seeds from one of the fir tree's cones. Immediately they took root and grew to a height of more than a foot. The holy man took them in his hands and blessed them. Then, just as the sun's rays began to make their appearance in the east, all of the trees in the gardens bowed down to the fir, as if it were the king of the forest. The tree was overwhelmed, and for several minutes it gazed down with great joy, watching the new young firs which would one day remind the earth that he had been there, and took part in the great promenade of life. By now, however, the holy man and his friends had been joined by some others, including some soldiers. A slight turmoil ended the profound silence that had filled the forest, and all the man's friends scampered and fled from the soldiers. This angered the fir tree. "If I had legs, I would never use them to leave a friend in trouble," it thought. The holy man was led away from the garden, and before long was well out of sight, while the sounds of the garden returned, and the world went on about its business. All that night the other trees bowed low to the fir. The next morning at first light, some axemen returned to the garden. Strangely, they bypassed several cypresses and junipers. They also ignored the oak and acacia. Instead, they went to the less important trees, of which the fir had long held the distinction of being the least important of all, and they began to cut. They cleared only a few of the worst and most useless trees in the garden. Surely they would be dried out and used for firewood, the fir thought. When at last they came to the fir, the chief axeman snickered and said, "I have a special use for this one." The fir began to think that perhaps it would be used in a building project after all. But despite its newfound hope, as the first blow of the axe sliced through its trunk, the fir shuddered at the thought of never seeing its little seedlings again. After the felling and dismembering, the axemen loaded the wood on carts and hauled it off to their carpentry shop in the city. Most of the wood was indeed chopped into small chunks and stacked to dry over the course of several months and would be used for firewood. The larger pieces, especially like those belonging to the fir, that were not hard enough to burn well, were set aside for a certain building task. From time to time, soldiers in town were in need of gallows to be built for the execution of the worst criminals. Their strange gallows, though simple, were especially cruel and peculiar. Not an hour had passed before a soldier from the governor's palace strode into the shop, demanding that a new gallows be constructed right away. Just 2 hours later, the newly made gallows could be seen moving along the roadside on the back of the holy man. He had been scourged nearly to the point of death while the gallows were being built, and was now struggling under its weight, even though the fir was light. Along the way, he could feel that the fir was in great anxiety over having to take part in the demise of its only friend. The tree thought that no one in the history of the world had ever felt the sorrow that it was feeling just then. The holy man gently patted the wood of his gallows and quietly whispered to it, "Now I bear you up, but soon you shall bear me. Is that not what friends do?" When he could bear his burden no longer, a man in the crowd bore the gallows for him, but the holy man kept a hand on the wood of the fir, both to steady himself and to comfort his friend. When they came to a small hill at a busy crossroads, the gallows was fastened to the earth, and the holy man fastened to the gallows, and by mid-afternoon, the holy man was dead, and the gallows burned in a fire. But while the story of what happened next to the holy man is well known, this is what happened to the fir. The winds of many centuries blew over the little garden where once the tree had stood. Its seedlings had grown and brought forth many others of its kind. Then one day, a great bird collected one of the cones while it was full of seeds, just as the ancient seabird had long ago, and it flew north over many days and nights until it came to the outskirts of a seminary near a dark wood, where it released the cone, and several firs grew up in the region. One day a monk, while out for a stroll, lighted upon the idea to cut down one of the smaller firs and take it home, where he stood it on a table and decorated it with roses cut from many colored papers, apples, wafers, sweets, gold foil, and even little dolls for the children in his charge, all to celebrate the birth of that holy man who had long ago died on the lonely hill with his friend the fir tree. It wasn't long before other people started decorating their own fir trees, and within a few centuries more, fir trees were being ornamented in homes all over the earth. The legend of the holy man would never be forgotten, and the spirit of the holy man and the spirit of that ancient fir felt the adoration of the people from across many generations in an ageless garden where time is merely a thought, and all destinies have long been fulfilled, and they were glad.